Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning cost, Part 2. The tools and techniques for the estimate costs process include expert judgment, no surprise here, analogous estimating, parametric estimating, bottom-up estimating, and three-point estimating. You have been exposed to these already when it comes to schedule estimates, and the concepts here are the same. Analogous estimating is when you estimate the cost of a project based on a similar project. So if you had a project that was very similar to this one that you did a couple of years ago, and it cost you $1 million, then you can estimate that this one will probably also cost about $1 million. You could use parametric estimating for costs, such as cost per square foot. If you're building a commercial building and the estimated cost per square foot is $100 per square foot, and you've got a certain amount of square footage in this building, then you can use the formula to calculate how much it should cost for the entire building. Or you can do bottom-up estimating, in which you add up all of the individual activities and work packages and sum up all of these different pieces and see what it's going to cost. There's also three-point estimating, which we've seen before and we'll go over again here briefly, which can apply to all sorts of other estimating techniques, whether it's analogous, parametric, or bottom-up. You can use three-point estimating in each of these cases. You will recall that the three-point estimating formula is based on three separate estimates for each task or activity or work package, or even applied to the project as a whole, or to particular deliverables. In any of those cases, you use three estimates. You estimate what you think is the most likely amount that it will cost, what the most optimistic cost estimate is, and what's the most pessimistic. You then average these in one form or another using different distributions depending on how much you want to weight these different estimates. The triangular distribution is one in which you just do a simple average. You add up these three estimates and divide them by 3. In a beta distribution, you assume that the likelihood of these estimates is shaped more like a bell curve, and in that case, you put more emphasis on the middle estimate and less on the ends. In this case, you multiply your most likely estimate by 4, and then add it to the other optimistic and pessimistic estimates and divide the whole thing by 6. And this provides you a weighted average that is weighting the middle part of the most likely. Let's take a look at an example of three-point estimating. Let's suppose you have a particular activity that the estimate is that it will most likely cost about $2,000. That optimistically it could cost as little as $1,000, or pessimistically speaking, it could cost as much as $4,000. It could be that there's this much variation in acquiring different goods and services. This is more likely based on development of something such as software development, in which you can have a wide range of estimates like this because you have so many unknowns involved. This is why having your scheduling information is important to your cost estimates. If you know that the range of estimates for how long it's going to take to complete this task is a range like this, then you can see that your cost estimates would mirror your duration estimates. Once you have these estimates, you could apply either a triangular or beta or other distribution. If you use a triangular, it's a simple average. 1 plus 2 plus 4 divided by 3 gives you $2,300 as your average estimated or expected amount that you think it will cost. Or if you think it's more of a probability curve like a normal distribution, you can apply the beta distribution to this and weight your most likely by multiplying by 4, and this gives you a 2.17 expected cost, $2,170,000. Other tools and techniques of the estimate costs process include data analysis, decision-making, and your project management information system. Your data analysis includes things like your alternatives analysis. As you are looking at different costs, you'll have to evaluate all sorts of different ways to get the project done, such as buy versus build, and how this affects your costs. Reserve analysis is about looking at your contingency budget. For each of your cost estimates, you may want to include a certain amount of cost buffer or contingency to allow for identified risks. Your risk management plan will provide guidance on what kind of contingency you should include and how, whether it's based at the activity level or the work package level or some other level within your WBS. You'll also need to consider the cost of quality. Are you going to spend more money trying to prevent quality issues? Or are you going to end up doing more rework or have warranty costs because of issues that didn't get resolved before they were sent out to the customer? In general, it's better to spend the money up front and invest that money early on to build quality in to your process and into your products. But here is where you'll need to decide, based on your quality management plan, how much you're going to need to spend on the quality processes and procedures and resources that you've identified need to be done. As you do this, you'll also have to do some decision making, and you'll need to decide on what process to use in decision making, whether this is something that is decided by your project sponsor or a board, and how this decision is made. If it's a board, if it's more than one person, how will the voting be done? And there may be different kinds of decisions that require different kinds of approval. Some of the more minor decisions could be left up to the project manager, while others to the project sponsor, and yet others to a board that decides. And of course, your project management information system should have some tools that include cost planning and management tools. And it's quiz time again. How much do you remember of the estimate costs process's inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques? The principal outputs are your cost estimates and your basis of estimates, which must go along with your cost estimates. There are also some project documents that might need to be updated based on what you do during your cost estimating. There may be assumptions that come up that need to be put into your assumption log, your lessons learned register. You could add some lessons that you've learned from your estimating process that can benefit other projects. And you may identify certain risks in the cost estimating process that require you to update your risk register. Then, as inputs, you have as main inputs your cost management plan, your quality management plan, because these provide guidance on how to do your cost planning and management, including your quality processes that will introduce some costs, and your scope baseline so that you have the details of what you're trying to accomplish. You'll also have your project schedule, because you'll need to know how long you expect things to take in order to estimate costs, as well as your resource requirements to know their resource costs. And your lessons learned register and risk register that can provide information that can affect your cost planning. And as always, your enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Your tools and techniques start with expert judgment, your estimating techniques that you've seen before, analogous, parametric, and bottom-up, as well as 3-point estimating. Data analysis techniques including alternatives analysis, reserve analysis, and cost of quality. And your project management information system that should include some tools to help you, and lots of decisions to make. Finally, we come to the last process in planning costs, which is determine budget. Your main outputs of the determine budget process are your cost baseline and your project funding requirements. A key point to remember is that your cost baseline is time-phased and includes contingency reserves, but excludes management reserves. In other words, your cost baseline needs to show how much money you're planning on spending over time, month by month or quarter by quarter, and so on. And it should include those buffers that you need for the risks you've identified, but it doesn't include management reserves because those are for risks that have not been identified, or what are known as the unknown unknowns. Let's take a look at the different components of your budget. We'll take a bottom-up approach and start from the right and work our way left. On the right-hand side, we have the activity cost estimates. Each activity will have an estimate, and each activity can have, it's not necessary, but each activity can have a contingency reserve. Then you take all of the activities for a work package and add those all up, including the contingency reserves, and that becomes the cost estimate for each work package. And you do this for each activity and for each work package. Now, for your work package, you can either add an additional contingency reserve, or if you didn't do any contingency reserves at the activity level, you could put them here at the work package level. Either way, there's a spot here to include some contingency reserve on top of your work package cost estimates. Those together become what are known as the control accounts. Two or more work packages are grouped together in the WBS and are known as control accounts. And it's at these points in the WPS that you decide ahead of time that you're going to measure performance on both cost and schedule. These control accounts then combine to form the entire scope of work for the project, and that forms your cost baseline. This is the amount of cost for your project that has been baselined and has to be controlled and only changed through your change management process. However, above and beyond your control as a project manager, there should be a management reserve that management can use to deal with some of the unknown unknowns. Risks and issues that come up that have not been identified ahead of time, but that need some funding to resolve the issue. This is at the discretion of management rather than the project manager or the process that you have for using contingency reserves. This, though it's not included in the cost baseline, is part of the overall project budget. And that's how it all adds up. Your funding requirements are a little bit different than your project budget. In other words, it's more than just your project budget. You need a total amount as your project budget, but you also need a picture that's time-phased to show how much money you need and when you need it. In this example, it shows a project with a cost baseline down the middle, with a little bit of an S-curve to it, and it shows the funding requirements along the way. It shows this as a stair step in this dashed line of how much funding you expect or need to have at different points along the way in your project. By graphing that across time, you then end up with a time-phased budget. In other words, your funding requirements. Determining the budget is, at a high level, a matter of aggregating all of the cost estimates that have been done to create an overall project budget. Looking at it from this simplistic perspective, you might think that all you need to do is take all of these cost estimates and add them all up according to the policies and procedures outlined in your cost management plan. However, it's important to also make sure that you account for costs that are above the level of activities and work packages. Some of these might include indirect costs or overhead costs that need to be applied to your project or portions of it. There may be travel costs that span multiple work packages that haven't yet been accounted for and need to be added into your budget. This type of information can come from your basis of estimates and other resources, such as your resource management plan and your scope baseline, which can provide details that will lead you to other costs that need to be included. Your project schedule is also important when it comes to coming up with your funding requirements, which is your time-phased budget. Your schedule will allow you to put the costs in the proper months or quarters or other time boxes that let you put together this time-phased funding requirements document. Your risk register will also have information about risk responses that have costs associated with them. And as a project manager, you have a responsibility to ensure that there is alignment between your project and your business case and your benefits management plan and other agreements that you have or will have in place, and to make sure that these align with the costs that you've come up with in your budget. In addition, you have, of course, as always, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that can affect your process and your project. Exchange rates and inflation rates, which can affect your costs. Although this has been done before when you estimated costs on individual activities and work packages, now that you're adding more costs at the budget level, these factors also can influence your project, as can the existing formal and even informal cost budgeting policies and procedures and guidelines and habits that your organization has, and your lessons learned repository's historical information about previous projects and how budgets were put together and what worked and what didn't. Your organization will also have cost budgeting tools that can be part of your project management information system, as well as different reporting methods that are prescribed or recommended for reporting on your project budget and its progress and performance. Tools and techniques for determining your project budget include expert judgment, of course, is at the top of the list, especially experts in financing or funding of projects. Cost aggregation is the rolling up or summing up or adding up of the cost estimates into a complete project budget. Data analysis involves reserve analysis, which at this point is mostly about the management reserves that should be added to your project budget above and beyond the cost baseline, but may also include some contingency reserves added to other costs that you've added to the project budget as a whole. The historical information review is listed here as a reminder that the different estimating techniques that you may have used, whether parametric or analogous, should be compared to historical information to see how accurate these estimates are, how reliable they are, and whether or not they're the best models to be using. Funding limit reconciliation is about your time-phased spending limits. You may have certain limitations on how much funding you can get when. For example, you may have a $1 million project, and your funding limitations are that you can only get those in $250,000 increments once a quarter. If you need more than that by the middle of your project, you may need to renegotiate your funding limits, or you may have to reschedule some tasks to be a little bit later when you do have the funding coming in for that portion of the project. This, by the way, would be an example of how you could have a critical path through a project that doesn't have zero total float because of an external constraint, in this case a funding limit, that affects the timing of your activities. And finally, financing is listed as a tool or technique because oftentimes with larger projects, especially public projects, these may require some rather complex financing. So here's our final quiz for this knowledge area. How much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of the determined budget process? The principal outputs are the cost baseline and the project funding requirements. Secondary outputs are things that could change in your project based on putting together your budget, such as your cost estimates or your project schedule, or new risks or changes to risks that need to be recorded in the risk register. There are many inputs. You, of course, need your cost management plan because it determines the rules for how you're going to put together a budget. Your resource management plan and scope baseline may also provide some details, as well as your basis of estimates. Your cost estimates are, of course, fundamental to your inputs because this is what you need to add up in order to come up with a budget. And you'll need your project schedule to time phase your costs. And your risk register may include some information that can affect your costs, especially when it comes to risk responses that have associated costs. As the project manager, you have a responsibility to make sure that you have alignment between your project and the rest of the organization, and the business documents, such as the business case and benefits management plan, as well as agreements within the organization and with other vendors or partners. And as always, there are a few enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that affect and help your project. A relatively new practice when it comes to cost management is the concept of earned schedule. This is based on earned value management. However, earned value management measures your costs and schedule performance in terms of dollars, whereas earned schedule measures your schedule performance in terms of time rather than money. And this can also provide better schedule performance measurement, especially in the later phases of your project. We'll get to this in detail in the lessons on earned value management. If you're managing an agile project, you'll probably use more lightweight estimation methods rather than the more detailed heavyweight methods of traditional cost management. And these will allow you to estimate at a high level and then provide more detailed estimates as you go along, sprint by sprint. Agile is also very useful for budget-constrained projects in which you've got a certain fixed budget and you want to get as much value as you can with that budget, because Agile focuses on delivering value early and delivering the most valuable pieces first. That way you can get the most out of your money as early as possible, and when the money runs out, you aren't left with an unfinished product. You're left with a product that has been elaborated on and improved based on the most important elements first, and stopping only when you run out of money. A few key high-level points to remember about cost management are that analogous estimating is based on similar projects. Parametric estimating is based on using a formula. Bottom-up estimating is where you estimate each individual activity or work package and then just add it all up. Three-point estimating uses pessimistic, most likely, and optimistic estimates and averages them in one way or another. The cost of quality needs to be included, and this can include both preventive and corrective actions. The contingency reserve in your budget is the amount of money you plan for to account for identified risks. The management reserve is not included in the cost baseline and is reserved for management to use on unforeseen risks and items that come up. Your funding requirements are your time-phased plan for how much money you need and when you need it. For more information, you can refer to the PMBOK guide on pages 231 through 256. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.